Continuing on the 14th order, House Bill 1181.
Engrossed House Bill 1181, a bill for an act to amend and reenact Section 16 of the Code relating to filling vacancies in the office of United States Senator.
Senator Dever. Mr. President, my wife's great-grandfather served in the North Dakota House in 1913, 15, and 17. We spent the weekend with her mother, and I came across a book that happens to be the session laws from 1915, and it was kind of interesting, and I brought it along. In that session, Senate Bill 137 became Chapter 150 of the session laws, which provided for the methodology of putting the position of the United States Senator on the ballot. That was timely at that point because the 17th Amendment had just been passed. And prior to the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators were elected by the legislatures of the various states. 17th Amendment then made that position elected by popular vote. Also, a provision in the 17th Amendment was that it called for the governors of the different states to call a special election to fill a vacancy for the United States Senate, unless the legislature passed a law to allow the governor to make that appointment. Well, apparently at some point they did, and House Bill 1181 comes now to reverse that and say that the filling of that vacancy would be by special election. A special election that would be called within 95 days of the vacancy. This is policy, it's good policy. Some might see it as politics, just because of the timing of it. And if it wasn't for the timing of it, I don't know that any of us would disagree that it might be good policy. So it's something that we should consider. Whether it's political or not depends on different circumstances that might come together in the next couple of years. But the question then would be whether or not the governor should be able to appoint their successor. If the 17th Amendment was about the people electing their senator, then the 17th Amendment should still be about people electing their senator. So your Committee on Government and Veterans Affairs on a majority vote recommends it do pass on 1181.
Senator Sinner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Maybe on the 8th order for the purpose of amendment.
Without objection, the Senate will be on the 8th order. Senator Sinner.
Mr. President, I move amendment 15.0568.02005.
Are there any senators who do not have a copy of the proposed amendment just referenced by Senator Sinner? If you do not have a copy, please raise your hand. You may proceed, Senator.
Mr. President, what this amendment does is it allows the governor to appoint an interim senator should we have a vacancy in the office. And I know there's been a lot of discussion, Mr. President, that we center around an election result where the U.S. senator comes back, runs for office here, and is elected and then appoints a replacement. However, we have to consider what happened in 1992. In 1992, Senator Quentin Burdick died while serving this state, and a replacement was appointed, and we all knew, everyone knew, that the replacement was not going to run for that office. And there was a special election held approximately 90 days later. I know all about this situation because my father was governor in those days, and he made this decision because he didn't want it to be political. He didn't want that election to be political, so he appointed Senator Burdick's wife to complete that term. All this amendment does, Mr. President, is allow the governor to appoint an interim senator. If we have a vacancy during a time of a crisis in this country or a farm bill being voted on, and we have a vacancy in that office, we will not have a vote in the United States Senate. Some of these votes are crucial. And I believe that this amendment will fix that problem, and that's why I'd surely like the Senate to approve this amendment. Thank you.
Any further discussion as to the amendment proposed by Senator Sinner? Further discussion on the proposed amendment by Senator Sinner. Senator Dever.
Mr. President, if all appointments were as the one was in 1992, the wife of the office holder, I don't know that anybody would disagree with that. The concern is whether or not the person that would be appointed would be to provide a political advantage in the ensuing election. One of the things that I failed to mention is previously is that this discussion regarding the U.S. Senate does not apply in the U.S. House of Representatives. And the reason for that is that was always a part of the United States Constitution, that it was only to be elected by a popular vote. So the purpose of this bill is to universalize the election of the Senate with the election of the House. Actually, if we had a vacancy in the Senate, that would leave one of our two voices quiet. If we had a vacancy in the House, North Dakota would have no voice in the U.S. House until that seat was filled. So, Mr. President, I guess I would just encourage a no vote on the amendment.
Further discussion on proposed amendment 15.0568.02005. Senator Carlisle.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a question for the senator from Fargo. I note on this amendment there is an author. As I assume it's your amendment, sir?
Senator Sinner, do you wish to answer the question?
Would you repeat the question, please?
Yes,
Senator
thank you,
Carlisle, would you please repeat the question?
Yes, Mr. President, I will. I know normally on amendments they have an author, so I assume if you're carrying this, Senator, this is your amendment. Is that correct?
Senator Sinner, do you wish to answer that question?
This is my amendment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Schneider.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. About 10 years ago, I had the pleasure to, some would say pleasure, some would disagree, of working in Congress and understanding what the North Dakota Congressional Delegation does for the state of North Dakota on a day-to-day basis. And I think the senator from Bismarck mentioned this may be about politics, maybe it's about policy. You can imagine my thoughts on that, Mr. President. But let's think through, if we're actually going to make this change in law, what this amendment would do. This is about North Dakota's 2 votes in the United States Senate. What if this vacancy occurs at a time when we're considering a declaration of war? North Dakota's only going to have 1 vote on that issue. What if this happens when we're considering a farm bill reauthorization? Do we seriously only want North Dakota to have 1 vote in the U.S. Senate? That doesn't even count the numerous services that are provided to the people of North Dakota in district offices from both of our senators. That includes things like making sure people get rural mail service, making sure someone's Social Security disability check gets paid to them on a monthly basis. Do we want those services to be shuttered to the people of North Dakota during an interim? And so whatever your motivations are in this bill, whether they're political or policy-wise, think through the policy. We want North Dakota to have 2 U.S. senators at all times. That's way too important of a position to leave in the hands of only 1 person. So please do adopt this amendment. Think it through.
Further discussion on the proposed amendment. Senator Dever.
Mr. President, I'd just point out that the bill says within 95 days. It's not necessarily the full 95 days, that it could be filled quicker than that.
Further discussion on the proposed amendment to House Bill 1181. Hearing none, that is the question. The proposed amendment to House Bill 1181. As many senators as are in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Nay. The amendment fails. Senator Mathern.
Thank you, Mr. President. May we please go to the 8th order for purpose of an amendment?
Without objection, the Senate will go to the 8th order for purposes of an amendment. Senator Mathern.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I move my amendment 15.0568.02006.
there any senators who do not have a hard copy of that proposed amendment? Please raise your hand if you do not have a hard copy. Senator Mather, you may continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I find it interesting to see the children at the front desk, and it made me wonder what metaphors children use these days to say what is fair here should be fair there. And many people who grew up in a rural area might say what is good for the goose should be good for the gander. But I don't know what children say who grow up in Bismarck or other cities, but it would be interesting to find that out. Essentially, the amendment that I'm offering here is making it clear that no matter what statewide office where there is a vacancy, we apply the same rules. So this amendment, if adopted, would say whether it was a United States Senator or a Congressperson or any of our offices where there's a statewide ballot, there would be a requirement that would be equal, essentially meeting the requirement that there be a statewide vote. So, Mr. President and members of the Senate, I would ask you to adopt this amendment so that we treat all of these offices the same. I think there are three good reasons for doing it, other than the general reason of consistency and fairness for all offices. One of the concerns I had when this bill was introduced in the House was that, maybe this was just kind of fooling around with some political issues, and so it probably never get to the Senate, that it would be defeated. But it actually came to the Senate, so I start thinking more about it and how we should address this. And I realized that over the past 5-6 years, we have had quite a few offices that have been appointed. We've had it seems like a style has come into popularity amongst elected officials that they don't fill out their office, that some way they resign, someone is appointed, and then that person who is appointed becomes the automatic position filler for that office. And I think that's a problem that we need to address, and an election would address that problem. The second issue that I'm concerned about is just the issue of fairness. I think it's difficult for our citizens to understand, when do we have an election to fill an office from a retirement or a sickness or somebody taking something up, and when do we have an appointment? I think it's good for democracy just to have that consistent so our citizens understand. When there's a statewide office, it's just an election that we have. And I guess the last point I wanted to make is that the bill essentially attempts to get more people involved in this decision when a United States Senator vacates the office. Well, this just builds on that. It just says, let's get the citizens involved in all of these statewide offices. So it's a statewide citizen involvement amendment. Mr. President, I'd be interested in hearing what the children would say about metaphors these days, but we can't hear from the children today. So let's hear from the rest of the senators. I ask you to vote yes on this amendment.
I'll hold them after for you, Senator. Senator Lafine.
Mr. President, I'm not sure who might answer this, but looking at online here, it looks like our U.S. Constitution states that a member of Congress has to be elected, that we don't have any choice on that.
Senator Flacco.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier, if I may.
State your question, please.
Mr. President, my question is, if the last proposed amendment was good to fill the potential gap created by a death or some other cause, won't this just add more lists or people to the potential list of those that could have that same gap that they were trying to fill with the First Amendment? It seemed like they would go counter one to the other, that this would expand the list of those who you may have to wait if that was a legitimate concern in the first one. And I'm not saying it's not, it's just that these seem to go counter to each other, and they can't seem, to be aligned very well.
Any senator wish to answer that question?
I'd be willing.
Senator Mather.
Thank you, Mr. President. Happy to. The last amendment failed, so we don't have that option before us. I think the point is great. Had that amendment failed, there would be that issue. It did. Had that amendment passed, it did not. And so we have this issue for all of the offices. So I would agree this issue remains for all of the offices. The issue also, in terms of the question from the senator from Grand Forks, in terms of the United States Constitution, that is the case. The bill was drafted, the amendment was drafted to make the amendment consistent with the United States Constitution. The amendment was drafted by Legislative Council, and so it clarifies that in addition to the constitutional requirement of electing our congressperson, we also would elect our persons for the Senate, the United States Senate, and the statewide offices in North Dakota.
Senator Dever.
Mr. President, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that statewide office holders should be elected, but I think that's a conversation for another day. That's not what's before us. I would point out that in the amendment that the repealer repeals a section of code that provides that in the event of a catastrophic situation which vacated 100 positions or more in the U.S. House of Representatives, that we would call a special election, and that would take place within 49 days. So this amendment would extend that period from 49 days to 95 days. So I'm not so sure that in this bill that we should be messing around with the election of a vacancy for the U.S. House of Representatives. I would encourage then that we not adopt this amendment.
Senator Oban.
Mr. President, as mentioned by the senator from District 32, this is actually what is in front of us. So I think it's worth having further debate about. If what we currently have on the books is a genuine concern, looking for a genuine solution through this bill's passage, then it's obvious that the bill's supporters should recognize the problems in all political appointments to elected offices, not just the one discussed in this bill. The senator from District 42 mentioned legitimacy to an argument. This amendment is very reasonable if the concern about appointments is a legitimate one. With this amendment, I will believe the concern is legitimate, and if we do not adopt this amendment, I will leave you with a more direct statement than what's already been beaten around the bush a bit. A wise woman, and by a wise woman I mean the senator from District 7, once said, and by once said I mean last Thursday, some bills are proposed to create good policy, others are proposed for politics. I think this is a good time for the Senate to show the difference.
Senator Casper.
Mr. President, I hadn't planned on speaking on this, but I just because it hasn't been up to this point, and I'm on this bill, and I think in general, I always support elections. I always support voting, people standing up for what they believe in, people having a discussion, going to the citizens of our state and saying, this is what I believe in, this is why I'm running for this office, I want your support, and let's have a discussion about the issues of the day and why two people are running for a particular office. But I think it's important in this discussion that we're having here on this particular amendment that we know that there's a distinction, a major distinction between being a United States Senator and being a statewide office holder. I would say that there's one similarity in that they are elected statewide, that the people of North Dakota all over the state can vote for these positions. But senators, just like United States senators, just like state senators here, are policymakers. They vote on issues of farm bills, it's been brought up here. They vote on war. They spend trillions of dollars at our federal government, and they make policy. Those policies are enacted by agencies. And our agencies in our state, more than most states, are headed up by elected officials. So in this, I think that's a very important distinction, that when we're appointing people to statewide elected offices that enforce the law. They do not make the law. And when someone's making the law, I want those people elected, and that's why I've supported this bill, and that's why I will oppose this amendment, because I think there's an important distinction that people in North Dakota should know.
Senator Schneider.
Mr. President, I realize there's a couple speakers ago, but just to speak to the point that was raised by the senator from District 43 regarding whether individuals are elected to Congress, the answer to that, of course, is yes. But a corollary to that is that special elections for the U.S. House of Representatives are held all the time, going back to Abel Foster back in 1789, according to the very reliable Wikipedia, as a matter of fact. And more recently, Mr. President, a special election was set by the governor of New York for a seat in the Staten Island district in that state. So this is something that has happened for hundreds of years and could happen again right here in North Dakota very sensibly if this amendment is passed.
Further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Sinner.
Mr. President, I would like a recorded roll call vote on this amendment, please.
Are there 7 senators willing to stand in favor of recorded roll call? Very well, we'll proceed by way of recorded roll call. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Axmus.
Thank you, Mr. President. A couple of speakers ago, we talked about statewide officials and the difference between making policy and enacting it. But it seems to me that this body and this current session has spoken a lot about policy enacted and done by the appointed and, well, I guess elected members of the Industrial Commission. So let's not kid ourselves that actions taken by our statewide officials do in fact impact policy, and I don't think that how they get to office should be any different than our United States Senator. So I'm going to rise in support of this amendment. Let's go ahead and have an open discussion on all of these vacancies for the state of North Dakota.
Further discussion on the proposed amendment to House Bill 1181. Hearing none, we proceed by way of recorded roll call vote. Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Secretary will close the key. The final tally on House Bill 1181 reveals 18 senators voting yea, 29 senators voting nay. The amendment fails. Back to the 14th order. House Bill 1181. Any further discussion on final passage of House Bill 1181? Senator Dever.
Well, Mr. President, just to recap now, if a vacancy occurs with this bill in 95 days or within 95 days, there will be an election to fill it for the United States Senate. That's good policy. Some people talk about policy and some people talk about politics, and which one you're promoting depends on your perspective. Because in this chamber, in those regards, there's nobody innocent.
Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier of the bill, which actually is related to the First Amendment, which failed. But I'm wondering if the committee considered or sought any legal opinions as to whether or not, should this bill pass, whether the governor of our state would still retain the right to fill the vacancy by appointment while the special election is pending.
Senator Dever, do you wish to answer the question? Senator Dever.
Mr. President, the 17th Amendment says that the governor shall call a special election unless the legislature grants him the authority to make an appointment. So I would say that if we pass this bill, that he no longer has the authority to make an appointment, but must call a special election.
Further discussion on final passage of House Bill 1181. Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, I was one of the people who voted against this. We've had a bill in way of doing this in place for 125 years, and I didn't see any reason to change it.
Any further discussion? Senator Sinner.
Just a question for the carrier, Mr. President. The question is, which governor, if we follow the scenario that many have taken, that our current U.S. Senator comes back and runs for governor in 2016, which governor then calls a special election, the current one or the new one going in?
Senator Dever, do you wish to answer the question?
That's an interesting question because the governors take office on the 15th of December, and the terms of U.S. senators ends on the 3rd of January. It would depend, I would imagine, on if the incoming governor was to resign their office before assuming the office of governor. And then it would be a matter of, if they vacate it before they take the office of governor, then the previous governor would have that option if they choose to exercise that. And I should point out that we are talking purely hypothetical.
Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, I could have supported this bill had the first proposed amendment been adopted. And there was conversation when we were discussing that amendment, which has of course now failed, about what it means to have someone representing us in the United States Senate. And at some point, the carrier of the bill suggested that not having a House member at any given point in time was more significant because we only have one of them and we have 2 U.S. senators. But it seems to me that just because that only happens because our state is a very small state in population, and everyone, I think, knows that there are 435 members of Congress, and it's really quite rare when a single vote makes a decisive difference in the House of Representatives, whereas there are only 100 members of the U.S. Senate, and so a single vote matters considerably more. And I think we also need to recall that our U.S. senators have special obligations that are not given to members of Congress, and those include the right and the obligation to ratify treaties, and the right and the obligation, as other people have already mentioned, to declare war. And I think that leaving ourselves in this position where we may not have a member, we only have one, and I mean, theoretically, I suppose we could be with no votes. I mean, if accidents happen, people die in airplane crashes, I mean, we would not like to think about those possibilities, but it could happen that we would have, for some period of time, no representation in our U.S. Senate. And one of the other primary obligations of senators, of course, is ratifying appointments to many different positions: federal judgeships, the U.S. Supreme Court, ambassadorships around the world, cabinet officials. These are incredibly significant decisions, and to suggest that we would be without that representation for a period of months is really unworkable, I believe. So while I do support the idea that we should have an election, I think it only made sense if it was done in combination with a temporary appointment. And without that temporary appointment, I'm going to be voting against this bill.
Senator Marcellet.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I was the other voting no on this bill. The reason for that is I believe the U.S. senators are employed by the U.S. government. I believe we're employed by the state as state senators, and I feel it should be an equal opportunity to be elected to our positions instead of appointed. Thank you.
Senator Mathern.
Thank you. I would also encourage a no vote to the bill. It's interesting, the specter that has now been raised by the chairman of the committee, the senator from District 32, when not only have we created an unequal situation with passage of these bills amongst different statewide office holders, we've also created the specter from his point of view that one could serve both as the United States Senator and the governor of the state of North Dakota at the same time. And I think it just clarifies this bill should not be here. I would suggest a no vote.
Senator Flacco.
Mr. President, for the record, because I think we were on voice vote in the first one amendment. I did vote for the First Amendment, and I said I would have voted for it in committee had it been offered up, but it was not. Can't help but think, and North Dakota is not Illinois, but if Illinois had this in place, they would probably, instead of 4 former governors being in prison, there would probably only be 3 former governors in prison in Illinois. Not to pick on Illinois, but just an observation that they continue to provide interesting things for talk show hosts and night show. A lot of our discussion also is somewhat presumptuous in that Congress isn't still exposed to gridlock, and that we'll pass more bills in a week than they'll pass in a year in this chamber. And I still go back to the philosophy that guides my vote today, that you can never go wrong with letting the people of the state of North Dakota decide who should serve them. And that's why I will vote green, because I think the people should decide, and I think this is in a timely fashion. When you look at the previous time, there was an appointment after about 8 or 9 days. It takes a little while for these things to ramp up, and there's usually adequate time to do this. So that is why I'll be voting green.
Any further discussion? Reminding the Senate we are voting. Reminding the President, we're off the proposed amendment. No, we're still on the proposed amendment. I'm looking at my screen wrong. We're in the final passage, right? The amendments. Good thing I won't be a tie. Any further discussion? Further discussion? Hearing none, the question is the final passage of House Bill 1181. Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Secretary will close the key. The final tally on House Bill 1181 reveals 27 senators voting yea, 20 senators voting nay. The bill is passed. Senator Klein.
Mr.